Going to give a couple seconds for people to get into the room here. So we'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. All right, well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Marcus Hotaling. I am the current president of the Association for University and College Counseling Center Directors. And I want to thank you for being here today for this webinar. I would like to just really quickly let my co-presenters introduce themselves. I'm just going to go down on the picture on mine. David, you're next. You want to jump in?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So hi, my name is David Walden. I'm the director of the Counseling Center at Hamilton College in Central New York.
Kim?
Hi everyone, Kim Gorman, she, hers, and I'm director of Western Carolina University's Counseling and Psychological Services.
And last but certainly not least, Lynn.
Hi everybody, my name is Lynn Braun, also she, hers. I'm the director of the Counseling Center at SUNY Oswego in Northern New York.
I should have said I'm director of the Counseling Center at Uni College, also in New York. A lot of New York representatives on this call. So I'm going to breeze through my the first slides because I want to leave the bulk of the presentation for our recommendations. So I'm just going to breeze through kind of how we got to where we are. But I'm also going to ask the participants of this webinar to use the Q&A if you have questions. We are going to try to get to as many of them as possible and answer them as they are coming in. But please be advised that we have a lot of people on this call. We may not be able to get to everyone, so we are going to do our best. So thank you very much. So really quickly, this is just who we are and what our mission statement is. We are a professional community that fosters director development, counseling center director development, and success to advance the mission of higher education. We innovate, educate, and advocate for collegiate mental health. We are committed to inclusive excellence and the promotion of social justice. So how did we get here? One of the things that we need to keep in mind here is that as a society, we have spent billions of dollars over the last 20 years to reduce the stigma associated with mental health. There have been tons of campaigns that have been focused on the fact that we need to treat mental health the same way we treat physical health. And it's been great. We really do need to treat any mental health issue as the same way we would treat a broken bone. Now, this has led to a decreased stigma, and then we partner that and pair that with all the societal issues that we have had going on over the last 20 plus years. The fact that the current college student generation was born into a post 9/11 world, born into a world that they have been at war their entire lives up until we pulled out of Afghanistan last year. So pair that with the decreased stigma, and we have a culture of overwhelm. We have a culture where our students are overwhelmed, and so are we. On top of that, we can see over the last 11 years, this is from the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, the CCAPS, scores, we see a significant rise in many, many things that have happened. Generalized anxiety, depression. We see this sudden spike in academic distress. So something happened in 2020. I don't know what it was, but that led to a significant increase in our academic concerns. But the two biggies are the depression and the anxiety and the social anxiety. Our students are lonely. Our students are scared. Our students are feeling depressed. And now they're starting to come into the counseling center at greater rates. Again, we've reduced the stigma. They're talking about it. All wonderful things. However, what we've also seen is we need to increase our enrollment. We need, where does the revenue come from? It comes from tuition. So there's been a big push across the country to increase enrollment. You look at certain schools, look at University of Central Florida. You go back 10 years, they were at 20-something thousand. You go to them now, they're at 60,000. One of the important things to kind of keep in mind here is a 1% increase in enrollment means a 5% increase in utilization rates for the counseling center. So I'm at a school with 2,200 students. 1% isn't that many, but typically when we bring in that 1%, it means forced triples. It means bigger class sizes, bigger issues. And what does that lead for us? What does that mean for us? It means we're burnt out. We are tired. We're trying to come up with creative ways to address all of the different situations. of how do we handle the influx of people coming in. And what has this led to? And again, this is my last slide before I turn it over to Lynn. But what does this lead to? It leads to this. It leads to a never-ending cycle of whack-a-mole. Okay, maybe I need to do stepped care. Maybe we need an auxiliary service. Oh, now my VP is calling me, asking me about this student or that student, or saying, hey, I got an email from this company. We should look at this. So we've been just whacking these things down nonstop. So that's why we wrote this paper. We wrote this paper to try to get some ideas out there that might help guide us so that we can stop whacking moles and maybe instead say, here's how we're going to address this in a more systematic, thoughtful manner. So that's my time. I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Marcus. We also recognize that, this paper got started by looking at what we kind of started identifying as a mass exodus of folks in counseling centers, of people leaving. And as we started to look at that issue, we also really know that that's happening in higher ed across the board as well. But we really wanted to try to identify what are the areas related to this overwhelm, to this burnout, and to, excuse me, these types of concerns. And we landed on 4 interrelated areas. The first being shifts in service demand, the second being mismatched service delivery models, which is, when we talk about the mismatch, as you'll hear a little bit later, I think from David mostly, looking at what we're trying to do versus what model we're trying to use to do it, use of third-party vendors, and salary disparities. That this combination of things is what we really identified as the interrelated areas. Which leads us to the 13 recommendations, I believe, that we have as a part of the paper. And I am going to go ahead and shift into, Marcus, if you'll shift to that next slide, talking about the first section of starting to solve this step 1, which is identifying and creating a comprehensive campus-wide strategic plan. And it really starts with thinking about, is the institution, does it see improving the mental health and well-being of our campus as everyone's responsibility? I think is a good first question. Do we want to maximize the impact we can have on student thriving, on student success, on maybe retention management from the mental health side? And what outcomes are we really looking for when it comes to looking at students' mental health? And then related to that outcome is what demand do we feel like we want to be able to meet? And not just in the counseling center itself, but in the campus-wide way, what outcomes are we looking for in relation to mental health? And when we do strategic planning, are we incorporating mental health issues and outcomes into that planning? Because a lot of institutions do a lot of strategic planning. And as you're doing that process, are you thinking about not just what outcomes and what demands you want to meet, but once you can identify that, what resources are you going to add to meet that demand? Which gets us out of this mismatch that we really identified that often happens. Picking outcomes and goals that then align with the resources we can put to them. It's important from our perspective, if you're going to do strategic planning on mental health on a campus, that you are looking to who are the most knowledgeable people on your campus, who have their ear to the ground on what's happening in collegiate mental health. And I think for most campuses, we would identify that the director of the counseling center is often the person who is the most knowledgeable and who is the most connected to what's happening both on your campus, but also to the greater mental health landscape. And the importance of making sure that director is involved in this process. And so identifying these issues led us to the first 3, Marcus, if you want to go ahead, to these first 3 recommendations. And the first of which is identifying key stakeholders who should be involved in developing a campus-wide strategic plan, making sure that that plan is coordinated and led by somebody who is the most familiar both with the resources and needs and concerns on your campus, but also in the greater landscape. Because we don't always know what we don't know. And so having somebody who is well connected and understands what's possible could be helpful in that process. Once we have identified those folks, we need to start defining an institutional identity around mental health, including the development of a campus-wide strategic plan that defines the institution's approach and how that approach is going to get resourced. And it basically, if you're then looking at it from the counseling center point of view, you want to be clarifying what demands we want to meet and what resources we want to provide to meet that demand. Along the way, making sure that there is alignment among those things so that the goals we set, the objectives we meet, have a possibility of being able to get realized and accomplished because we've resourced them appropriately.
Okay, so David Walden, Hamilton College. So just as there is a sort of larger strategic plan, larger way of thinking about a campus's approach to mental health, there's also a larger set of services that a counseling center offers to a community, right? Counseling centers offer consultation and training, outreach, a great many different services. What we're digging into in this section is the service delivery model of the center. In other words, what they're doing with their most resource intensive or financially intensive resource, which is the one-on-one, or if it's a group, one on 5, 6, 7, 8 students, the time of the clinicians that are working in the center. So we really wanted to dig into the service models that centers have used to deliver those clinical services, mainly because that's the place where a great deal of this pressure is being felt. When we're talking about increased demand, we're talking about the choices that institutions are making around what they're doing. The service model of the counseling center is where a lot of that comes to bear, because that's in some ways, the most precious resource, the resource of the people that work in that center. One of the big pressures that's operating on service delivery models, what we're doing is we're sort of observing some of the pressures and then making some recommendations. One of the big pressures is increased demand. This is a story that everybody knows. The average utilization rate of a counseling center went up, of course, over the decade between 2011 to 2021. Went up from 10% to 13%. That may not feel like a lot. What's a more interesting piece of data is the upper range of utilization. So in 2011, when we surveyed counseling centers and looked at utilization, the upper range, the most highly utilized center, was 18% of that student body was using that center. Now the range is up to 39%. So there are a lot of centers who are being impacted in really huge ways by increases in demand, which is putting pressure on that system. Sometimes I think about it as the math problem of the work that a counseling center does. And there just are only so many ways to solve that math problem. And the math problem has gotten infinitely more complex for a lot of campuses. Okay, so that's the big pressure at play. There are also some other factors at play that we point out in the paper. And several folks have asked, will the slides be available? We're going to make the slides available. I would also encourage you, you can download the paper off of the AUCCCD website. And I would just encourage you to dig in, because every point that we're making and everything we're talking about, we really flesh out in the paper in a broader way. There are a couple of dynamics that we're pointing out in the paper that are also operating on counseling centers. One that you're likely experiencing on your campus is this broadening of what is meant by mental health. We're observing that students are using, and we're all using that term mental health to mean a great many more things than it meant even 5 or 10 years ago. My own take on it is that this growth in the use of the term mental health mirrors the same growth we've had around other embodied parts of our identity. So just in the same way that we have more language and permission to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity or gender in general, or race, different embodied parts of us, we now have more language and permission to talk about our mental health and our well-being, that embodied part of our being. The extent to which that means that students and our communities have more freedom to express these parts of themselves in the same ways, that's great. The extent to which it means that everything that is a mental health concern needs a licensed clinician, that's not great. That's where the math problem comes into play. My own take is we've broadened the definition of mental health. We have yet to broaden the sets of interventions and things that are available for it. Or another way of thinking about it is that we are now describing our inner experiences in a more open way, but really only have a narrow set of languages and terms to talk about those things. So we go to the language of mental health to talk about a great many things. That is a force that's operating on the service delivery models and counseling centers. It's putting a great deal of pressure on people. And it often prompts questions like, how do we meet demand? Or statements like, we can't hire our way out of this. Our take in the paper is that the question of how do we meet demand is no longer an operative question. If we go back to what Lynn was just saying about intentionality and making sure that we're putting resources to the problems that we choose to deal with, then the question really isn't how do we meet demand? The question is, as Lynn was saying, what demand do we want to meet and how are we going to meet it? The last thing that we're observing as a force at play is that in response to a lot of increased demand, a spectrum of models of clinical service delivery models have emerged in counseling centers. Those of you in that world know on one end of that spectrum are the so-called treatment models. In that model, students are usually given some sort of, there's usually regular contact with some portion of a population that is seeking services from a counseling center. That would look in a treatment model something like weekly contact of hourly sessions, for example. On the other end of the spectrum are what are either called access or absorption models. If you like them, you call them access. If you don't, you call them absorption, you know. And in those models, the idea is that every student is going to get a touch point, right? And in between these spaces are where counseling centers exist. And things that have emerged on one end are things like 30-minute meetings or single session, right? Things like that, all triage focus. Things that have emerged on the other end are, hourly, weekly, unlimited sessions, that sort of a thing. These are the models that have emerged. Our position on that is that there's no right or wrong answer. It's just simply that institutions should be intentional about the model they're choosing for their organization and their needs, and that those models have consequences, and those models exist within the realm of things we know. So on the next slide, what we're going to talk about is the idea that, there are things that we do know about psychotherapy, and there are things we do know about the use of clinical services. It's one of the things we observe in the paper that I really enjoy is this statement that it's an odd fact that the clinical service models of counseling centers have been driven more by demand than by what we know about what works in therapy, which is sort of a strange thing. Things we know, relationships matter, and relationships tend to drive change. That's the common factors knowledge, right? That relationships drive the bulk of change in therapy. And we know that relationships tend to thrive under consistency. We know some things about dose effect literature that, if you want a certain percent, if you want over 50% of your population to change, there is some dose effect literature that says you need between 13 and 18 sessions. If you want only 20% of your population to change, there's some literature says, just offer between 1 and 5 sessions. And one of the things we observe is that it's a strange reality that the average number of sessions for most counseling centers is about 5, and the average number of weeks in a typical semester is certainly between 13 and 18. So these are all things that we know. We also know there's some literature that says when you meet with people regularly or weekly, there's faster change. We're not saying that one of those things is better than the other. We're just saying that these are facts and information that's out there, and in the context of which decisions can be made about what makes sense for each institution. You can imagine an institution where a touch point for every student and a triage approach for every student makes perfect sense for their resources and for their goals And you can imagine an institution where a treatment model might be a mismatch for what that institution needs. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. These are the recommendations that flow from that. Again, we're asking institutions to clarify what demand do you want to meet? What resources are needed to meet that specific demand? Let's not operate from the position of how do we meet demand? Let's decide what demand we're going to meet. Let's measure our resources that we're bringing to bear, whatever the choice is, whether the choice is we're going to provide more of what would be called a treatment model, or whether the choice is we're going to provide something that's more of an access framework. Making sure that the resources are considered relative to utilization. So one of the things we talk about in the paper is FTE is a commonly considered metric when talking about clinical resources. There's nothing wrong with that metric, but that metric is a little bit agnostic relative to utilization. So we're looking at measures like the CLI from CCMH, the Clinical Load Index, which measures resources relative to utilization. It's saying, it doesn't matter if you have 5 counselors, if you have 40% of your student body coming in, And then lastly, identifying or developing a clinical services model that doesn't attempt to meet every demand, and we've said this again and again, but is choosing demand. So this implies, going back to the slides that Lynn was talking about, this implies that an institution is saying, here's the portion of our population we're trying to meet. Here's the intentionality we're bringing to this space. Okay, so these are our observations about clinical service models. I'm also talking about third-party vendor roles, so you have to hear me for a little while longer. I apologize for that. So the third-party vendor piece is basically just recognizing that COVID jump-started a huge growth. There's been a ton of investment in the third-party vendor space. No doubt we're all getting emails left and right about different services. We're making just a couple of basic points. One is that there are different types, and we need to begin talking about the different types because there's a lot of conceptual confusion around the different types. So for example, I'll just pick a couple from here. An intervention type of third-party resource is adding clinical resources to your suite, right, of resources. That would be services that are literally adding clinical hours to what it is that you do. Wraparound care, in contrast, would be like a referral resource that's increasing pipelines and pathways to external clinicians, but those two things aren't the same. So we're just observing that sometimes there's some conceptual confusion around the differences between some of these things. And we're offering that there are preventative resources that are looking at more health promotion frames. There are well-being resources like a call map type of a thing. There are intervention things that are adding clinical hours, wraparound care resources, which are having referral pipelines, education like psychoeducation resources on particular topics, and then peer support resources, which are connecting people. But making distinctions between those things is really important. We are also asking that people look through the lens of 3 questions when considering third-party resources. What category is being considered? Again, let's be clear about what's being considered, because that contributes to frustration. You can imagine what it's like for a VP or institution to invest in a wraparound care resource, for example, and then find out that it's not solving the problem that we wanted to solve. It didn't add the clinical hours we wanted. Everybody gets frustrated with that. Second question, let's be honest about, specific about what needs are being targeted. Again, being intentional. Which portion of our population are we trying to reach? Does that goal align with the resource that's being used? Are we being smart about that? And then the last question is being honest about, will the resource actually meet the need that we're trying to meet? The observation that we make in the paper is not meant to pick on anyone, but for example, there are resources that are working off of like a population model. We're offering X number of sessions for all students over the course of a year. If you were to cost that out and see what the cost would be for offering 9 sessions, let's say, to every student on the campus, it would be far more than the contracted amount, right? And so just being honest, like, you can imagine an institution where that approach, that population model approach, makes a ton of sense, where you know that only 3 or 5% are going to use that resource, and the rest will be reassured by the fact that it's out there. And you can also imagine an institution where there might be an expectation that that more students were getting those sessions, and the fact that they weren't able to meet that demand would be frustrating to the institution. So we're asking, instead of reflexively sort of lunging at resources to solve the problem, that we bring some intentionality and thoughtfulness into that space as well. So the recommendation: just assess what services would be consistent with your goals. Be realistic. Is that service actually going to meet that goal? And then we're also proposing that we begin as a field to assess efficacy of these resources in an ongoing way. This is a new thing. A lot of this stuff just started, so it's understandable that we haven't totally stepped into that space yet, though some of them are doing their own assessments, but that we also do an assessment of outcomes and if these services are really benefiting our student populations. That's it for me.
So that brings us to my part of the presentation, which is focused on salary. We've already had one question show up in that Q&A. I know this is on a lot of people's minds and hearts, certainly mine. And this step actually takes us back to the beginning. Actually, where we started this paper was just recognizing how this particular part of the job that we have and the compensation is contributing also to the burnout that staff is experiencing. And certainly the 3 steps we've talked about already, we recognize are kind of part of that burnout recipe. And this is just kind of that, we left this as like the last part of the paper because we just see this as kind of a foundational piece of how do we take care of the people who are doing the work that we just talked about in these previous steps. So this step magnifies the importance of reconsidering salaries for staff who are working in counseling centers. We have all been challenged with retention. I know we've been challenged with recruitment. I'm going to talk about that here a little bit more in a second, but that's what we're really talking about in this step. Unfortunately, there is no national database by which we can compare salaries for the people working in counseling centers. We can't compare that to people working in other settings. There's just no database to do that. And we see that as a real challenge for us to advocate for salary adjustments for staff. And it's unfortunate because those other settings are the settings that we're competing for staff at this particular time. And oftentimes they generally offer higher salaries than what we're able to provide. So even though there's no national database, what we did find is some comparative data around different salaries. This, for example, is the psychologist comparative data that we found. AUCCCD does collect salary data yearly. We collect that data from our members. Directors have said this database that we have is very helpful for advocating for salary adjustments when a new position becomes open, and at times helpful for petitioning for salary increases across the staff when possible. So this slide denotes information from our survey for last year. That was the salary collected for, get my years straight here, 21 to 22, because we're right now collecting 22 to 23 data. So in 2020 to or 2021 to 2022, the mean salary for a psychologist, according to our data, was $74,000. So it's compared this to the U.S. Bureau of Labor's data, which says that the mean salary for psychologists is $81,000. So obviously our salaries are a little bit lower than the U.S., the government's listing of that salary. Even more problematic, though, is most of us in our universities use the College and University Professional Association, or CUPA, data for setting salaries across our institution, including our counseling centers. So I want you to note that CUPA lists that psychologist salary at $67,200. I mean, very problematic. As I said, so many of our universities and colleges use that CUPA data. And what we see is a difference between that and the Bureau of Labor, which I still think is pretty low salary is $14,000. Our staff have options about where they go to work. They can work in a VA, they can go to a hospital, they can go to a group practice or a solo private practice. And salary is, and I say should be, a very important part of the decision that they're making about where they're going to devote kind of their heart and their soul with their career. In fact, this past year, we did ask a question on our annual data or annual report about what are reasons staff are leaving. And the number one reason that directors said was low pay. So even though we can look and use data from the UCCCD database and from the Coupa database, in the end, we're comparing my low salary to your low salary, and that just isn't enough. And the problem with salary is not just that staff are leaving, but we believe it's also part of the problem. We're having difficulty recruiting staff to come to counseling centers. Now, when I first began my career many years ago, I knew I wanted to work in a counseling center. It was a very competitive market back then, and the applicant pool was very large, but this has changed. Marcus is going to show us kind of how that's changed for this past year. Last year, the average pool for qualified applicants for doctoral positions in counseling centers was 3.3 people. 3.3 people was the average pool for qualified applicants. The average pool for qualified applicants for master's positions was only slightly higher at 7.3. And we think this is why 78% of counseling center directors are saying that they have difficulties filling positions. And this is, again, last year's data. So we have to be realistic, and our administrators, we have to be realistic about what people simply are just not applying to our jobs anymore. And we in the paper, we talk a little bit more about having open positions not filled just has consequences for those people who are working in the centers, those who remain. There are less staff to provide needed services for students. There are less staff to supervise trainees if we have those programs within our center. We have less staff to supervise staff who still need supervision because they're in their postgraduate year. And as I hinted at earlier, we really want them all to stay. We want staff who we've recruited and hired to continue working with us. People choose counseling center work because they enjoy working with the student population, because they enjoy working in a community of care across the university. We've built skills to do that. We have real talent in working with 18 to 25-year-olds. And that's our specialty. We have skills working with partners across campus. We know how to refer. We know what the resources are. And we want to retain that knowledge and expertise in our center because it benefits not just us as hiring people as directors, it really benefits our clients. And we want to retain directors. We're having difficulties with that across our organization, our data shows. Now, the four of us on the screen were a little bit different. I asked them over the weekend to tell me how long we've been in counseling center work. And the four of us represent 75 years of counseling center work. And I, just pause and think about the wisdom that we have accumulated, the expertise that we offer is something. And that same expertise and wisdom that our staff have is also very, very meaningful and is worth something. So just as competing employers, for example, private practice may have attractive salaries, they also have some work options that are attractive for our staff. And so we really need to focus on retention. And we can do that by emphasizing flexibility and some autonomy within our workplaces. And that we really think this kind of simple solution can be very meaningful to staff. So we really make a recommendation about how to evaluate that and that the possibilities of incorporating that within our workspace and our work culture. And the other recommendation is that recommendation number 7, and it really is calling for additional salary databases to be developed so that we really have an idea of how to rate our work and compensate individuals who are doing the work so that we are competitive with other providers who are also soliciting the workforce that we are interviewing as well. And that's above and beyond what we're able to do as an organization. However, we're really calling for our administrators to look at just the real problems with the way that salaries have been set to date, because it's just we're not being competitive, and we're losing out on really good people who we want to continue working with us. So we are at a critical juncture. We believe it necessitates this very strategic approach to supporting mental health needs of our campus, supporting the clinical staff who work in our counseling centers. And we believe that the recommendations that we've made in our 4 areas that we've touched on today provide a template to evolve this conversation about mental health on our campus. And this final recommendation is actually the recommendation that we have that we think brings these 4 strands together. And that really is about aligning our messaging. It's aligning our resourcing that's consistent with this defined approach of mental health, and that we're able to communicate that to our campus constituents, which includes not just the people who work on our campuses, but also those who are coming to us, the students and parents who will be spending time with us over the next 4 to 6 years. And I think that last slide, Marcus. So what this system alignment really means is that everybody is on the same page about what the counseling center can and what it does do. So it means from the time a student is recruited and their families come to campus, they know the approach that the counseling center uses on that campus. It gets repeated when they come to orientation. It gets repeated for faculty and staff who are new to the university and also go through their own orientation. It's communicated to the people that we're hiring, that they know what our approach is and what the university supports. And we believe that that's going to be really helpful for some of that, for that retention as well, because they kind of know they know what the job entails and what the approach is going to be. I'm going to pull in the other presenters here to also kind of to talk about their what this system alignment means to them as well.
One thing that comes up for me around the system alignment piece is, and this is like a key thing that I expect a lot of folks out there are experiencing, which is that mismatched expectations actually manufactures stress. When you think about mismatched expectations in how things are aligned, right? The campus tour is given and a student and a family expects a certain level of service. You recruit a staff member and say, they're like, I really want to do therapy, or whatever the situation might be. And you say, great, we love that, come on. And then the student, and then you can't solve that math problem, right? It's overloaded. The student expects the certain level of service. The clinician is expecting to do a certain kind of work, but the demand is demanding something different, or the system is reacting to the demand in a way that's demanding something different. Those mismatched expectations actually manufacture stress for everyone in the system. And that's one of the things I think we really need to grapple with, is that that is stressing out students, it's stressing out staff, it's stressing out administrators. Can you imagine how frustrating it is to not be able to get at the problem in the way you want to get at it as a VP or a president of a college? That makes stress for everybody. The other piece for me that comes up around alignment is when we take a more intentional approach, we are saying that we're going to shape the narrative rather than being shaped by it. We're saying we're going to marshal the talent and resources of all the people at this institution to shape what it is that we're doing, rather than feeling like we're forced into being reactive to some unrealistic goal, which is doing everything. That can't be done. Those are the things that came up for me when thinking about the alignment piece.
I'm just going to piggyback on what David. Sorry that I think I just cut you off. I apologize. Something that David just said is, we are expected to do everything, and I think unfortunately this has kind of become the narrative for higher education, is that everything can be solved through counseling, when in reality, everything can be solved, or much of what is referred to counseling can sometimes be solved just with empathy. and a faculty member responding with empathy. I have a colleague who shared a story that their partner had referred a student immediately to the counseling center when they had indicated that their parent had passed away. Or when they said, my parent passed away, that's why it's been absent, the faculty member said, we have a counseling center on campus, correct? And the student said, thank you, and walked away. What that student needed was, I'm sorry to hear that. How can we help you catch up in class? And this kind of goes, again, back to what David said before, where everything has become a mental health problem. The reality is, there are mental health concerns, there are mental health issues on campuses. Not everything is mental health issue that needs weekly counseling for 4 years in a higher education setting. And that's just something to be mindful of. Now, Len, I know you want to say something, so I'm going to be quiet and pass it over to you.
No, it's all good. Actually, it's good that you went first. I think that what I have to say comes on the end of yours, which builds in. It's why the strategic plan is so essential, that it's campus wide. It's not a counseling center strategic plan. That the reality is there is, every person on campus. I think institutions, most will say every person on campus, has a role in retention management for a campus, or student success or thriving for a campus. Every person on campus can also have a role, right, to play in students' mental health and well-being. And it doesn't always take a lot. It's partly to the example that Marcus was just giving. And so in some ways, this alignment is having everybody just orient their minds actually just slightly differently, right, to a different way of thinking and approaching people. And the second thing that really came to my mind in listening to everybody is, system alignment does require us to choose, and that can be difficult, right? That there are difficult choices to make. But if we can, at every level, right, and if at every level in institution we can choose and we can align the resources and the messaging, then it does create, right, an environment where everybody knows what to expect, everybody knows what they can get. And there was a question in the Q&A about, did we have anything about retention for staff for access versus treatment? And I think we said, well, no, we don't have that. But I think the bigger issue is, I think when things are not aligned, as David was talking about stress, that's the largest risk factor. If everybody understands exactly what to expect and they all come in eyes wide open, the odds of them getting frustrated in that system are much less. And so, but if not, if somebody is overpromising on one side or another, right, and those things start getting confused, or we think we can do treatment and we can't for whatever reason, because we've now decided access is important, then it can get frustrating, right, and stressful. And so aligning the messaging piece of that at every level becomes critical.
There's a question that about alignment that sort of prompts an additional reflection. The question is like, okay, the challenge we have is that we can provide more at the beginning of a semester when our caseloads aren't overloaded than at the end of the semester, or I would say for a lot of us, the middle. Sometimes it's March and October that you're like, oh no, we're full. That's part of the alignment piece, actually, is this alignment piece also requires a great deal of nuance, but there are some nuances that aren't that hard to explain. To be able to say to a prospective student or family, or to a system, hey, we have a lot more space at the beginning, as you might imagine, when we're starting from scratch. And as the semester builds up and more people use services, that math problem, that balloon gets a little more inflated or something. And that's a fairly, that piece of nuance can be conveyed, and that's actually part of the alignment piece too, is conveying those particularities of your system.
Yeah, I've seen just a flurry of things coming through. So I wanted to leave some time to maybe answer some of those questions. But Marcus, I think you're going to wrap up at least this portion.
Yes, so obviously these are our contact information, and we want to thank all of you for coming to this webinar today, but also remind you that this is a process, and part of the process actually starts with reading the paper and passing along the paper to those who might benefit from it, whether that be your AVP, your VP. But these are suggestions. These are the things that we are hoping that we can all kind of look towards a framework and a guidance for how to move forward through this process and through this system. Because the reality here is we've all been kind of very reactive to all of this because it happened very quickly. And then COVID just made it 1,000 times worse. So now what we want to do is have some guidance and have some structure. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that I can actually see the chat and help answer some of the questions, because I can't do that. But again, thank you all for coming here today and spending some time with us today.
There's a chat comment that points out that this is not a zero-sum game, that a lot of this work is around situating our advocacy for alignment and, intentionally using resources in the larger framework of what an institution is offering students. So the comment was about, working with student health and well-being, working with health promotion, being part of that larger conversation about what is the institution. I mean, a counseling center makes decisions, right, about what we do with our resources, but an institution is could be also making decisions about, well, we deploy counseling this way, and then health promotion this way, and other resources this way, and that's how we're dealing with our whole population, which then takes some pressure off of us as well. So thanks for that from David.
There are a couple questions actually in the chat, in the Q&A. One about student-led initiatives in special populations, and another on how to increase responsibility for well-being beyond the counseling center. I guess my answer to both of those is in that if a campus is willing to engage, right, in a comprehensive strategic planning process, there's room for it all. If you can connect to academic folks and get them to understand, it actually doesn't take a lot for them to be really helpful. There are really small things that they can do, right? And figuring out ways to maximize that, and that doing a little actually saves them a lot of stress too, because faculty and staff are also stressed. There's not I think the athletic side of house is also getting a lot of directive, not just from students, but from the NCAA and others, right, about what to do. And again, if everybody is included, right, in this comprehensive plan, if we know how all the pieces are working, then there's room for it all, and there's a way to figure out how they all integrate together to make students' well-being the best it can be on our campuses.
I see one of the questions that I'd like to respond to has to do with, what makes us attractive now, what makes a counseling center job an attractive job. And because we have been maybe alluding to across this hour, things have changed, as Mark said, changed quickly. And the kind of job I started in 20 years ago is not the job I have now. But what keeps me staying is I do love the work. I love this population. I love working with colleagues who are committed to the same type of vision that I have, both for the students as well as for this organization. Now, how do we sell that? I think that goes back to how do you create a culture that has some autonomy and flexibility for staff that really speaks to the type of individual or employee who's going to do well in your center. And it's very, very different than it once was.
And I'm going to piggyback on that and answer, I think, a question that came in about overselling the individualist solutions. And the reality here is, one of the things that I think makes working at a counseling center so different, while it seems that we have the same stressors and the same factors that other positions have, that it used to be kind of a more cushy job where you had your summers, whereas the summers don't exist anymore. The reality here is the training that all mental health care individuals, whether I don't care if you have an LMHC or if you have an ABIP from Harvard University, like the reality is we're all trained in individual models, where a private practice mentality, where you can say to a person that calls you, I'm sorry, I don't have space. Contact your insurance company. We don't have that luxury within the counseling center world. We can't say, we're not seeing you. Now we can help offer referrals. We can also set demands to say, your needs are too extreme for what we can offer here. The problem is we have parents, and I'll use an example that we had many years ago. A parent called and said, my child has been in a therapeutic boarding school for the past few years. What services do you offer? And my response was, not what that therapeutic boarding school offered. And are they ready to be here? And the reality was they were not. So part of this is setting expectations, but doing so with staff as well. So kind of like what Kim said, what do we offer? We offer the ability to have consultation. We offer the ability to walk across a hall and speak to somebody and get supervision and get guidance, which in an individual model, if you're in a group practice, maybe you have that. But the reality is in a group practice, time is money. So if I'm spending time with you, then I'm not earning any income. A no-show, I do a little no-show dance when I have a no-show. If I was in private practice, I would actually be a little annoyed that, oh, this person's no-showing me, that's costing me income. So these are just some of the things that when you're recruiting, some of the things you can talk about. Collegiality, the fact that you can root for a team, or you have free plays or concerts and little things that, that aren't offered in a community-based setting.
I think one other thing I just want to say, I know we're just about out of time. I saw some things in the chat about administrators and hoping administrators would hear this. That was actually who this paper is written to, is to our administrators. And we have presented this in a couple of different conferences and will continue to do so. We encourage you to make sure your administrators know of this position paper, and we've provided the link in the chat. Just encourage you to send that along. If you have other ideas about how we can get that word out to administrators, of course, we're very open for that.
There's a couple of things in the chat about recognizing the importance of very human responses in a system. That as students broaden out what they mean by mental health, that we're not asking faculty or staff or others in the institution to be counselors. We're often just asking for a very human response to what are a very human set of concerns. And one specific form of this question talked about, how do counseling center directors view health promotion as a significant portion of the path forward? And I can just answer for me just to say that very human piece is so important in that. We're doing some partnering here, for example, around working with what mental models are students using when they say mental health. What do they mean by that? When they want help for mental health, what does that mean to them? We're making a lot of assumptions about that. We don't really know. And I think there's a lot of partnerships that can be had with health promotion. There are very similar movements in the counseling center world and in the health promotion world that are looking to more structural solutions. And I think there's a great deal of interface and partnership there. I would say if there's any of the New York people, or if you really want to come to New York and visit where Marcus and Lynn and I are, there's a New York State Health Association conference happening in October, and there's going to be some very interesting conversations there between health promotion and counseling center folks, and also third-party vendors and counseling center folks. So I just think we're gonna talk more about this stuff, moving forward.
Absolutely. I just want to comment on somebody that put something in the chat that said the director can threaten to quit if the administration does not show interest, which I find hilarious. And unfortunately, the reality is, and I've said this to our director of HR, I said, if I leave, you will pay me more, you will pay the replacement more than you're paying me, and you will have a hard time recruiting them here. So one of the things that we really need to focus on is helping people, helping our upper administration, helping our human resources start to realize that the pool has shrunk. There are many schools out there who have failed searches, name schools that have failed searches based upon the fact that they have not been able to get enough applicants. The reality here is most people aren't willing to move for a counseling center job. They're not willing to move for a counseling center director job. They're going to move for a vice president job. They're going to move for a president job. But you're limited in who you're going to actually get. And then you also have to keep in mind, are they willing to come to the institution you're working for the pay that you're offering? So it is definitely something we could say, we're willing to quit. They need to realize that replacing us might be very, very difficult.
And I would say the intentionality and the hard decisions that are required by that is certainly a thing, right? But haven't we tried it the other way? And we're all pretty stressed out. When we talk about including administrators, I mean, come on, we're all dealing with the same math problem and we're all pretty stressed out. So doesn't it make sense for us to go down a different path? We've tried the other way. We've tried to be everything. It hasn't worked. Let's, let's try a different way of moving forward that we define. Yeah.
Well, I think that great ending, David. So thanks, everyone. We do hope you found it helpful, and we wish you well as you navigate the last couple of weeks of your semesters or quarters as they come to a close.